3 miles beneath the rolling waves of the Pacific, the massive hull of the Akagi rests in a crushing, eternal silence that no human lung can ever touch. On a bright, clear morning in June of 1942, this steel giant was the pride of an empire, carrying the weight of a nation's destiny across the Midway Atoll. Now, the twisted metal and scarred decks tell the story of a ship that did not just sink, but was systematically consumed by its own design. The journey to this final resting place begins in a world of absolute midnight. At a depth of over 16,400 feet, the water pressure exerts a force of nearly 8,000 pounds per square inch, a weight capable of flattening all but the most specialized titanium spheres. Here, the sun has not reached the seafloor in millions of years, and the temperature hovers just above freezing. Into this void, the lights of a remotely operated vehicle, or ROV, cut a narrow path through the silt. The particles in the water, often called marine snow, drift past the camera lenses like falling ash, creating an atmosphere that feels more like a cathedral than a graveyard. As the cameras pan across the seafloor, a massive shape begins to materialize from the gloom. It is a structure of undeniable scale, a wall of steel plate held together by thousands of rivets that have withstood 8 decades of saltwater immersion. The ROV glides upward, its thrusters kicking up clouds of fine sediment until it reaches the upper works of the ship. Suddenly, the lights reveal a command bridge known as the island. To the untrained eye, it is simply a piece of wreckage, but to the historians and engineers watching the live feed, it represents a profound geographic impossibility. In the history of naval aviation, 99% of aircraft carriers are built with the island on the starboard side, or the right side of the flight deck. This is not a matter of aesthetics, but of pilot safety and aerodynamics. Yet, as the ROV circles this ghost of the deep, the cameras confirm that the island is situated on the port side. Only one Japanese carrier in the history of the world was ever deliberately built with this reversed configuration. This is the Akagi, the flagship of the First Air Fleet, the Red Castle of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Seeing it in person for the first time since 1942 brings a haunting clarity to a mystery that has lingered for 77 years. The discovery of the wreck in 2019 by the research vessel Petrel solved the where, but it immediately reignited a fierce debate over the how. For decades, the final moments of the Akagi have been a point of contention between two different schools of historical thought. On one side, American after-action reports from the Battle of Midway describe a decisive victory where U.S. dive bombers sent the carrier to the bottom with a series of well-placed hits. To the American pilots, the Akagi was a victim of their skill and the overwhelming power of their 1,000-pound bombs. On the other side of the ocean, Japanese accounts tell a more nuanced and perhaps more painful story. According to the logs of the destroyers that escorted the flagship, the Akagi did not sink because of American bombs alone. These records suggest that the ship remained afloat for nearly 20 hours after the initial attack, stubbornly refusing to submerge despite the fires raging within her. In this version of history, the Akagi was not sunk by the enemy, but was scuttled by her own people to prevent her from falling into American hands. It was a mercy killing carried out by Japanese torpedoes, a final act of ritual suicide for a ship that could no longer fight. Without physical evidence, these two narratives remained in a state of permanent friction. Historians could only speculate, weighing the reliability of adrenaline-filled pilot reports against the defensive tone of defeated naval officers. The ocean floor was the only witness that could settle the matter, yet the Akagi remained elusive, hiding in the vast, deep trenches of the Pacific where sonar technology of the 20th century could not reach. The ship was a ghost, a legend whose physical reality was slowly being replaced by maps and ink. When the research team finally located the hull, they did not approach it with the eye of a treasure hunter or a sentimentalist. Instead, they treated the wreck as a forensic subject. To understand the Akagi is to treat the seafloor like a crime scene or a battlefield autopsy. Every dent in the steel, every warped bulkhead, and every scorched section of the flight deck is a data point. The wreck is a structural failure captured in time, a complex machine that was pushed beyond its breaking point and then preserved by the cold and the dark. This forensic approach is necessary because the Akagi was a ship that was never truly meant to exist. Her story began not in a shipyard of visionaries, but in the sterile rooms of international diplomacy. Following the end of the First World War, the world's major powers sought to prevent a ruinous naval arms race through the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. This agreement placed strict limits on the total tonnage of capital ships each nation could possess. For Japan, this meant a hard choice. They had to scrap their most ambitious projects or find a creative way to circumvent the rules. At the time the treaty was signed, the hull that would become the Akagi was already under construction as an Amagi-class battlecruiser. She was designed to be a fast, heavily armed predator of the seas, over 800 feet long and weighing tens of thousands of tons. Under the new treaty, she was an illegal vessel, a ship that had to be destroyed. However, the treaty allowed for a single loophole. Nations were permitted to convert two capital ship hulls into aircraft carriers, a new and largely unproven technology that the old admirals still viewed with skepticism. Japan faced a crossroad. They could scrap the hull and lose millions of yen in investment, or they could attempt a radical conversion. The decision was made to turn this battlecruiser into a floating airfield. This was not a smooth transition. The Akagi was a compromise from the very beginning, a hybrid of old-world heavy armor and new-world aviation needs. She was a monster born from the constraints of diplomacy, a ship whose very bones were designed for a different kind of war. As Ezra Vogel and other historians of Japanese modernization have noted, the Imperial Navy of this era was defined by a desperate need to do more with less. They were constantly fighting against the industrial might of the United States, which led them to adopt radical, often experimental designs. The conversion of the Akagi was the pinnacle of this philosophy. Engineers had to figure out how to take a hull meant for massive 16-inch guns and turn it into a platform that could launch and recover fragile biplanes. There was no blueprint for such a task. They were writing the rules of naval aviation as they went. The resulting ship was a testament to Japanese ingenuity and a harbinger of the tragedy to come. To walk the decks of the Akagi in the 1920s was to walk through a laboratory of steel. The engineers were worried about everything from the weight of the aircraft to the way smoke from the funnels would obscure a pilot's vision. Every solution they found seemed to create a new problem, leading to a design that was increasingly complex and increasingly fragile. When we look at the wreck today, we are looking at the final result of those early decisions. The portside island, the massive hangar spaces, and the heavy battlecruiser belt armor are all visible in the ROV footage, frozen in a state of decay. These features tell us that the Akagi was not just a ship of war, but a ship of contradictions. She was built to be the most powerful weapon in the Pacific, yet she carried within her the structural flaws that would eventually lead to her ruin. The calm, reflective silence of the wreck site stands in stark contrast to the noise and heat of her creation. As the ROV moves slowly along the hull, it passes over rows of rivets that were hammered into place by men who believed they were building an unsinkable fortress. They could not have known that 77 years later, their work would be an object of scientific curiosity, a puzzle to be solved by robots and sonar. The Akagi remains a haunting reminder that even the most formidable machines are ultimately at the mercy of the sea and the decisions of those who build them. As the years of the 1920s transition into a decade of increasing tension, the Akagi begins to take on a form that looks more like a grand experiment than a standard naval vessel. In her early years, she is a strange and beautiful sight, a ship with 3 separate flight decks stacked like a tiered wedding cake. The idea behind this radical design is one of pure efficiency, born from the minds of engineers who are trying to solve the problem of simultaneous operations. They want a ship that can launch fighters from the lower decks while simultaneously recovering returning scouts on the upper deck, all while the middle deck is used for preparing the next wave of strike aircraft. In theory, this layout is a masterpiece of logistics, but the reality of the open ocean is far less forgiving than the drawing board. As the ROV cameras today glide over the remnants of the hull, we can see where those original decks once integrated into the massive frame. At the time, however, the triple-deck configuration creates a nightmare for the pilots. The airflow over the bow is turbulent and unpredictable, and as aircraft engines grow more powerful and heavier, the short takeoff runs of the lower decks become dangerously obsolete. Furthermore, the smoke from the massive funnels, which are curved downward to keep soot off the flight decks, often swirls back into the hangar spaces, choking the ground crews and creating a hazy, toxic environment for everyone on board. By 1935, the Japanese Admiralty realizes that the Akagi must be reborn if she is to lead the empire into a modern conflict. She is taken into the Sasebo Naval Arsenal for a reconstruction that will last 3 years and transform her into the monster that would eventually dominate the early months of the Pacific War. The 3 decks are stripped away and replaced by a single, massive flight deck stretching over 800 feet from bow to stern. This new deck sits high above the waterline, nearly 70 feet in the air, giving the ship the appearance of a floating mountain. It is during this rebuild that the Akagi receives her most distinctive and puzzling feature, the portside island. Historians such as Ezra Vogel have noted that the Japanese approach to naval design during this period is one of extreme specialization. The Akagi is intended to work in perfect harmony with her sister ship, the Kaga. In the tactical manuals of the time, the 2 carriers are often seen as a single unit. To make the movement of aircraft in the sky more orderly, the designers placed the island on the right side of the Kaga and the left side of the Akagi. The idea is that the 2 ships can sail in parallel, and their respective air groups can fly landing patterns that do not overlap or interfere with one another. It is a decision made for the sake of a neat and tidy sky, a human solution to a geometric problem, yet it ignores the fundamental instinct of every pilot to bank away from the island in an emergency. While the rebuild makes the Akagi a terrifyingly effective weapon, it also introduces a series of critical flaws that no one seems willing to acknowledge. To maximize the number of aircraft the ship can carry, the hangars are built as fully enclosed boxes. Unlike American carriers of the same era, which often have open-sided hangars that can be vented if fuel vapors build up, the Akagi is a sealed environment. Within these steel walls, the air is thick with the smell of high-octane aviation gasoline and oil. The ventilation systems, though advanced for their time, struggle to clear the fumes. Every time a plane is fueled or a torpedo is moved, the ship becomes a giant pressure cooker of flammable vapor. Beneath the new flight deck, the engineering of the Akagi remains rooted in her battlecruiser origins. She is fast, capable of reaching speeds of over 31 knots, or about 35 miles per hour. This speed allows her to create her own wind for launches, but it comes at the cost of internal protection. The ship's aviation fuel lines run through the heart of the vessel like veins of liquid fire, often passing near the very areas where munitions are stored. There is a sense of dangerous confidence in this design. The Japanese naval philosophy, often called the decisive battle doctrine, emphasizes the power of the first strike. They believe that if the Akagi can hit the enemy first and hit them hard enough, she will never have to worry about being hit in return. This philosophy of aggression permeates every inch of the ship. The hangars are not just storage areas, they are high-speed assembly lines where hundreds of men work in cramped, dimly lit spaces to arm and fuel the aircraft. In these hangars, torpedoes and bombs are often moved with a sense of urgency that borders on the reckless. Records indicate that to save time during a battle, ordnance is sometimes left on the hangar floor rather than being returned to the safety of the armored magazines deep below the waterline. The ship is a masterpiece of offensive power, but she is a glass cannon, a vessel that cannot afford to make a single mistake. As the morning of June 4th, 1942, dawns over the Pacific, this dangerous confidence is on full display. The Akagi is the center of a massive fleet, a collection of steel and fire moving toward the Midway Atoll, with the belief that they are invincible. The air is warm, with a light breeze coming off the ocean, and the sun reflects off the polished wings of the Zero fighters lined up on the deck. For the sailors and pilots, there is no sense of impending doom, only the routine of a navy that has not yet known a significant defeat. They are the masters of the ocean, and the Akagi is their throne. However, behind the scenes, the first cracks in this invincibility are starting to show. The American carriers, which the Japanese believe are far to the east, have already been detected, but the reports reaching the bridge of the Akagi are fragmented and confusing. Admiral Yamamoto's plan is complex, and the rigidity of the Japanese command structure makes it difficult to adapt to new information. On the hangar decks, the order is given to change the armament of the planes from torpedoes to bombs and then back to torpedoes again. It is a monumental task that involves moving thousands of pounds of explosives in a frantic race against time. By 9:00 a.m., the hangar decks of the Akagi are a scene of controlled chaos. Armorers are sweating in the humid heat, using manual winches and carts to swap out the heavy weapons. Because of the pressure to re-arm the planes as quickly as possible, Many of the bombs that are removed from the aircraft are not taken back down to the magazines. Instead, they are simply pushed to the side and stacked against the hangar walls. These piles of high explosives sit out in the open, surrounded by fuel lines and aircraft filled with gasoline. The Akagi has become a floating fuel-air bomb waiting for a single spark to ignite. The crews on the flight deck are equally busy. They are working to launch the CAP, or Combat Air Patrol, to fend off the first waves of American torpedo bombers that are starting to appear on the horizon. These early American attacks are disorganized and ineffective, and the Japanese gunners easily splash the slow-moving devastators into the sea. Each successful defense only adds to the sense of security on the Akagi. The sailors cheer as they watch the American planes fall, convinced that their ship is untouchable. They do not see the dive bombers circling high above in the clouds, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This period of 90 minutes is perhaps the most vulnerable moment in the history of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Akagi is caught in the middle of a transition, her decks cluttered with fuel hoses and her hangars filled with exposed explosives. She is unable to launch her full strike force, and she is unable to land the aircraft that are already in the air. She is a giant that has been momentarily blinded by her own complexity. The sun continues to climb in the sky, and the temperature on the metal decks rises, yet the men below continue their work, unaware that the clock is ticking down to the final seconds of their empire's dominance. As the ROV surveys the wreckage today, we can see the mangled remains of the elevators and the warped steel of the hangar bulkheads. These are the silent witnesses to those 90 minutes of vulnerability. The physical evidence shows a ship that was literally torn apart from the inside out. The engineering that made the Akagi a monster also made her a victim of her own design. She was a ship built for a war of total aggression, leaving no room for the messy, unpredictable reality of a counterstrike. In the quiet of the deep ocean, the Akagi remains a monument to the peril of overconfidence and the fragile line between a masterpiece and a catastrophe. As the morning heat reaches its peak, the tranquility on the bridge of the Akagi is shattered by a sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. At exactly 10:22 a.m., the sky above the Japanese fleet suddenly fills with the screaming whine of dive bomber engines, a high-pitched roar that cuts through the rhythmic thrum of the ship's turbines. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, leading a small group of dauntless dive bombers from the USS Enterprise, makes a split-second tactical decision that would alter the course of the 20th century. He realizes that the bulk of his squadron is diving on the carrier Kaga, and in an instinctive move of predatory precision, he banks his aircraft toward the flagship. He releases his 1,000-pound bomb at a steep angle, watching as it hurtles toward the expansive flight deck of the Red Castle. The bomb does not strike a glancing blow. It hits near the aft elevator, slicing through the wooden planks of the flight deck with a terrifying ease. It does not explode on the surface, which might have caused manageable damage. Instead, the heavy casing plunges deep into the upper hangar, detonating in an enclosed space packed with fueled aircraft, pressurized oxygen lines, and stacked munitions. This is the moment where the Akagi's fate is sealed. It is not the external weight of the explosion that sinks her, but the internal pressure that begins to tear her apart from the inside. The blast creates a massive shockwave that radiates through the ship's ventilation shafts, blowing out fire suppression systems and turning the enclosed hangar into a furnace. Within seconds, the floating fuel-air bomb, created by the morning's frantic rearming process, is triggered. The aviation fuel, stored in lines that were never properly armored against internal concussions, begins to pour into the lower decks. Torpedoes that were left out in the open, sitting on transport carts, rather than in armored lockers, begin to cook off. They explode one by one as the ambient temperature reaches hundreds of degrees Fahrenheit, sending jagged shards of steel through the bulkheads. The fires are so intense that they begin to melt the aluminum skin of the aircraft stored in the hangars, creating rivers of molten metal that flow across the deck like volcanic lava. The ship is essentially being hollowed out by its own weaponry. On the bridge, Admiral Nagumo and his staff are momentarily stunned by the violence of the impact. The smoke is so thick and the heat so extreme that the command center becomes untenable within minutes. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy is being consumed by a fire that no human agency can extinguish. Historian Rana Mitter has often reflected on how these few minutes represented more than just a military setback. They were a systemic collapse of an entire philosophy. The Japanese doctrine of total offensive power had left no margin for error, and once the fire took hold, there was no centralized way to fight it. The communication lines were severed almost instantly by the internal blasts, leaving individual damage control teams to fight impossible blazes in total darkness, isolated from their commanders. These men, working in temperatures that would peel the skin from their bones, used handheld extinguishers and buckets against an inferno that was melting the very ship around them. Despite this internal devastation, the Akagi proves to be a remarkably resilient structure. Her battlecruiser hull, built with heavy steel and a robust system of watertight compartments, keeps her buoyant even as her superstructure begins to sag and warp from the heat. For 19 agonizing hours, she remains afloat, a blackened, smoking ruin drifting aimlessly in the central Pacific. The fires are so hot that they glow through the steel plates of the hull, turning the ship into a gargantuan, hellish lantern that can be seen for miles in the gathering twilight. The crew, those who have survived the initial blasts, are forced to huddle on the few remaining sections of the deck that are not yet red hot. As the sun sets on June 4th, the reality of the situation settles over the Japanese leadership. The Akagi is no longer a warship, she is a floating pyre. Admiral Yamamoto, watching the reports come in from his own flagship hundreds of miles away, is faced with a choice that is both strategic and deeply personal. He cannot allow the pride of the fleet to be captured by the Americans, nor can he leave her as a drifting wreck that might be salvaged or studied by the enemy. The order is eventually given to the destroyers Arashi, Hagikaze, Maikaze, and Nowaki to move in and finish what the American bombs had started. The execution is carried out with a heavy heart and a silence that speaks of profound grief. The destroyers maneuver into position, their crews watching as the flagship that had led them to victory at Pearl Harbor now sits dying in the dark. This is a moment of ritualized tragedy. The final blows are not delivered by an enemy, but by the Akagi's own protectors. 4 Type 93 torpedoes, often called long lances for their incredible range and power, are fired into the side of the carrier. These weapons, carrying nearly 1,000 pounds of explosives each, strike the hull with a force that finally overcomes the ship's stubborn buoyancy. The Akagi begins to roll slowly to her port side, the very side where her unique island stood as a symbol of her singular identity. As the water rushes into the scorched hangars, the escaping air creates a haunting, whistling sound, like a final breath being drawn from a giant. She slides beneath the waves, bow first, her stern rising momentarily into the moonlight before disappearing forever. The water closes over the spot where she had floated for nearly 2 decades, leaving behind only a patch of oil and a few pieces of floating debris. The survivors on the nearby destroyers stand at attention, many of them weeping as they watch their home vanish. They are now witnesses to the end of an era. The Red Castle is gone, and with her gone, the myth of Japanese naval invincibility has been shattered. The ocean returns to its natural state of calm, hiding the wreckage in a descent that will take it nearly 3 miles down to the seafloor. In the deep, the pressure will eventually equalize, and the fires will be extinguished by the cold, but the damage done in those 5 minutes of the morning will remain etched into the steel for eternity. This sequence of events highlights a peculiar paradox of naval warfare. The Akagi was built to survive a direct engagement with enemy battleships, yet she was undone by a single bomb and a series of internal failures. The very complexity that made her a formidable aircraft carrier became her greatest weakness when the fires began to spread. The wreck that now sits in the darkness of the Pacific is a monument to this fragility, a reminder that the most powerful machines are often destroyed by the smallest of oversights. In the silence of the deep, the Akagi finally found the peace that she could never achieve on the surface. As we look back on those 19 hours of struggle, we see a ship that fought to stay alive long after its purpose had been extinguished. The sailors who stayed behind to fight the fires, the engineers who kept the pumps running until the very last moment, and the captains who had to give the order to scuttle her, all of them were part of a drama that transcended the simple mechanics of war. It was a human tragedy played out on a stage of steel and fire, a story that would remain buried in the depths for 77 years until the wreck itself began to speak. Meanwhile, as the decades turn into a lifetime, the memory of the Akagi remains suspended in the vast, empty reaches of the North Pacific. For 77 years, the ship existed only in the yellowed pages of deck logs and the fading recollections of the men who survived her final day. She was a ghost of the deep, a legend whose physical presence had been swallowed by an ocean so vast that it seemed capable of hiding even a 1,000-foot-long giant forever. The search for the Akagi was not merely a hunt for steel and rivets, it was a quest to find the closing chapter of a story that had remained unfinished since the summer of 1942. The reasons for this long silence are found in the geography of the abyss. The Akagi does not lie in a shallow coastal shelf, but in the deep basin of the Pacific more than 3 miles below the surface. At this depth, the environment is almost entirely static, yet it is also incredibly hostile to discovery. The ship sank bow first, a massive weight of steel plunging through miles of water, gaining momentum as it fell. When it finally struck the seafloor, it did so with enough force to bury its forward section deep into the ancient sediment. This impact, combined with the catastrophic internal explosions she suffered on the surface, meant that the Akagi did not settle as a perfect, recognizable silhouette. Instead, she became a part of the landscape, a distorted mountain of metal shrouded in the fine, gray silt of the deep. Early sonar technology of the 20th century was simply not capable of seeing through 3 miles of water with the clarity needed to distinguish a wreck from the volcanic rock of the seafloor. It was like trying to find a needle in a hayfield while looking through a frosted window. For years, expeditions passed over the general area, their instruments returning only blurry, indistinct shapes that could have been anything. It was not until 2019 that the research vessel Petrel, operated by Vulcan Inc., brought the necessary resolution to the search. Using autonomous underwater vehicles that can fly just a few hundred feet above the bottom, the team began to map the area with a precision that was previously impossible. In October of that year, the sonar screens finally displayed a shape that stopped the hearts of everyone in the control room. It was a massive, boxy structure, nearly 800 feet long, showing the unmistakable proportions of a capital ship. The dimensions were a perfect match for the Akagi, yet even then the team remained cautious. Without a visual confirmation, a sonar return is just a shadow. The wreck lay in such a state of ruin that it was difficult to tell where the ship ended and the debris field began. The midship section, where the American bombs had detonated and the Japanese torpedoes had struck, appeared to be heavily damaged, almost as if the ship had been broken in two before it reached the bottom. It would take another 4 years for the world to truly see the Akagi again. In 2023, a joint expedition utilized high-definition ROVs to conduct the first-ever visual survey of the site. As the cameras descended through the water column, passing through the twilight zone and into the midnight zone, the tension on the surface was palpable. When the lights finally illuminated the hull, the first thing that became clear was the sheer scale of the preservation. Despite the violence of her sinking, the cold, oxygen-poor water had kept the steel in a remarkable state of grace. The rivets, each one a testament to the laborers of the 1920s, were still visible, and the heavy armor belt of her battlecruiser origins remained firmly in place. The most emotional moment of the survey came when the ROV rose along the port side of the hull. There, standing like a silent sentinel, was the island. To see that command bridge on the left side of the ship was the final, definitive proof. No other ship in the world looked like this. The visual confirmation settled the 80-year mystery of the portside island's fate. It had not been sheared off by the wind or the waves during the sinking, but had stayed with the ship all the way to the bottom. Seeing it there 3 miles down was like looking at a fingerprint that identified a long-lost relative. The forensic data gathered by the ROV allowed historians to finally reconcile the conflicting accounts of 1942. The damage patterns on the wreck reveal a complex story of destruction. The cameras documented the massive holes in the flight deck where American bombs had penetrated, confirming the accuracy of the dive bomber reports. Yet lower down on the hull, the survey also found the unmistakable inward curled steel that results from a torpedo strike. These marks provide physical evidence of the scuttling by the Japanese destroyers. The wreck proves that both sides were right. The American airmen delivered the fatal blow, but it was the Japanese torpedoes that finally sent the ship to her grave. Historian Jonathan Spence has often noted that the physical remains of the past have a way of stripping away the layers of propaganda and national pride that often cloud our understanding of history. In the case of the Akagi, the wreck does not take sides. It reveals a ship that was a victim of its own engineering as much as it was a victim of enemy fire. The ROV footage shows how the enclosed hangars acted as a trap, funneling the force of the explosions throughout the length of the vessel. The forensic evidence confirms that the Akagi was a masterpiece of offensive capability that lacked the defensive resilience to survive a modern aerial assault. Beyond the technical and the historical, the Akagi remains a war grave. 267 sailors went down with the ship, and their presence is felt in the heavy, respectful silence of the ROV control room. There is no plan for salvage, and no artifacts will be recovered. The site is a sacred space, protected by the depths and by international agreement. The ship is no longer a weapon of war, it is a monument to the human cost of conflict. Those 267 souls are now a part of the ship's legacy, their stories intertwined with the steel that served as their home and eventually their tomb. The lesson of the Akagi extends far beyond the specific events of the Battle of Midway. It is a story about the limitations of technology and the danger of rigid doctrine. The Japanese Navy believed that their superior training and radical ship designs would guarantee victory, yet they failed to account for the unpredictable nature of luck and the resilience of a determined opponent. As modern scholars like Sheila Fitzpatrick have observed in the context of large-scale systems, the most complex organizations are often the most vulnerable to a single, catastrophic failure. The Akagi was a system of thousands of moving parts, and it only took 1,000-pound bomb to bring the entire structure to its knees. Today, as the ROV lights fade and the cameras are pulled back toward the surface, the Akagi returns to the darkness. She sits in a place where time has no meaning, her portside island still pointing toward a sky she will never see again. The mystery is solved. The forensics are complete, and the forensic record is now part of the permanent history of the world. But for those who look at the images of the red castle resting in the silt, the feeling is one of quiet reflection rather than triumph. We are left with the image of a ship that was once the most feared object in the Pacific, now reduced to a silent, rusting skeleton. It serves as a reminder that the path of history is often decided in a matter of minutes, by the decisions of a few individuals in the heat of a moment. The Akagi was a dream of empire made of steel, and her presence at the bottom of the ocean is the ultimate testimony to the fleeting nature of power. As we move forward into an uncertain future, the wreck in the dark remains a beacon, urging us to remember the human lives that are always at the center of our grand designs. The ocean has a way of smoothing over the scars of the past, but it never truly forgets. The Akagi will remain there, 5 miles below the waves, for centuries to come. She is a part of the earth now, a strange and metallic reef in a world of water and pressure. Her story is a part of our collective memory, a reminder of a time when the world was on fire and the destiny of nations rested on the decks of ships like the Red Castle. In the end, the Akagi is no longer a mystery to be solved, but a lesson to be remembered. The discovery of the Akagi is a rare moment where the physical world rises up to meet our historical imagination. For nearly 8 decades, we could only picture her through the graininess of black and white photographs or the dramatic strokes of wartime paintings. Seeing her now, in the stark and unblinking light of modern technology, is a humbling experience. It reminds us that history is not just a collection of dates and names, but a physical reality that leaves a mark on the world. The Akagi, with her unique portside island and her battle-scarred hull, is a bridge between the living and the dead, a tangible connection to a generation that is slowly passing into the mist of time. There is a profound peace in the images of the wreck. Away from the noise of politics and the heat of battle, the ship has found a dignity that she perhaps never had in life. She is a reminder that despite our greatest efforts to build machines of invincible power, we are all ultimately subject to the laws of nature and the consequences of our choices. The 267 men who remain with the ship are not forgotten. They are held in the quiet embrace of the deep, their service and their sacrifice etched into the very grain of the steel. As we look at the Akagi one last time, we are reminded of the fragility of our own world. The things we build with such certainty can vanish in a heartbeat, leaving behind only shadows and questions. Yet in the act of finding her, we have proven that the human spirit is possessed of a relentless curiosity and a deep-seated need to find the truth. We seek out these ghosts, not to relive the pain of the past, but to understand the journey that brought us to the present. The Akagi is finally at rest, And in her silence, she has given us a gift of clarity and a reason to pause and reflect on the weight of our shared history. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. If this journey meant something to you, we'd be honored to have you with us again. Until next time, stay curious and take good care.